Hi, and welcome back to another C# beginner tutorial for the Stride game engine. In this final tutorial, we'll have a look at instantiating prefabs. As you can see, I've opened up the instantiating prefabs tutorial from the C# beginner template project, and I have this empty entity called prefabs demo, to which I've attached the instantiating prefabs demo script. Now, before we go into code, let's first have a look at a prefab that was pre-made for this tutorial. Inside the Solution Explorer, we have the Assets folder, and in there we have the Prefabs folder. And there we can find this prefab called Pile of Boxes. If we double-click it, it will open this prefab in the Prefab editor. Now, notice that all these boxes, they are listed here to the left, somewhat similar like a scene which displays all of its entities. We always get a prefab root and then all the entities that are part of this prefab. Now for this scene, I'm just going to drag in this pile of boxes by simply holding the mouse down and then just letting go. And it's going to be added to our main scene, which I don't want. I want to have this part of the instantiating prefabs tutorial scene. And there we go. We get a pile of boxes prefab. Actually, we get a bonus entity since we're using the editor for this. And all the entities that are part of the actual prefab, they get the postfix prefab followed by the name of the actual prefab, which is pile of boxes. So with that prefab added to the scene, let's first talk about what we're going to do in this tutorial inside our code. We are going to add a property for the prefab that is listed here inside the asset view, not the prefab that has been added to the scene. And then we're going to instantiate that prefab, which looks kind of similar to loading content. Then you will see that this can be done in various ways. So let's get to it. At first, we're going to make a public property of the type prefab. And let's just call this pile of boxes prefab. Now let's instantiate our entity. So I'm just going to call this instance, and then our pile of boxes prefab, let's call upon the instantiate method. And this method doesn't take any parameters, but let's have a closer look at what we're actually getting back. When we call this instantiate method, you might expect that we get some sort of main entity or some sort of new prefab back, but that's not the case. We're actually getting back a list of entities that the prefab exists out of. So if I switch back to the Stride Game Studio real quick, and if I open up that pile of boxes, then we're getting the list back of the entities that you see here, nothing else. That also means that there's a slight difference to what you normally see if you would be using a prefab or dragging a prefab into the scene when you're using the editor. Here you get this sort of bonus entity where all of the objects are listed under. So in code, you don't get that. You just get a list of all the entities of the prefab itself. Now that we've instantiated the prefab, we also mustn't forget to add all those entities to the scene. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing anything of this prefab at all. So we can say entity.scene entities, and instead of adding all the entities piece by piece, we can simply say add range, and then we can add the instance, because that instance is actually a list of entities. So let's go back to the editor, make sure our scripts have been compiled. We're going to go to that prefabs demo script, and notice we have this pile of boxes prefab property here. And if we say select an asset, notice how we do not get the scene hierarchy, so this particular scene here on the left, but instead we get the asset view. And that's because when we instantiate prefabs, we need to select an asset that is inside our asset view and not an asset that has already been loaded into our scene. So we can go to the prefabs folder and simply select the pile of boxes there. Now that we've done so, let's start the game and see what happens. Our game has started. Let's select the last tutorial, and there we go. We can see that this is the original pile of boxes that I've already just dropped into the scene, and our instantiated prefab, it's created at coordinates 0, 0, 0. Okay, so now we've created an instance of a prefab that we've dragged in here to this property, but we can also just as easily load it through code like we've seen in the previous tutorial. So let's do that next. Let's call this the prefab content. And we're going to say content dot load, and then we specify the prefab type, and between the parentheses we have to specify the path. Now, like we've seen in the previous tutorial, all we have to do is hover over the prefab in this case, and we can see the URL of our prefab. So we can just right click on it and click on copy asset URL and simply paste that in here. So now that our prefab content has been loaded into memory, now we can do that instantiating again. So let's just copy that line, call this instance number 2, and we've loaded it from the prefab content. So one last thing that we can do here is, instead of adding all these entities that are part of this instance 2 directly to the scene using the add range method on the entities of our scene object, but instead we can also just create a new entity. Let's do that. Pile of boxes entity is new entity. Let's give it a nice position. Let's place it a little bit lower so that we can stack them nicely together in the scene. We could give it an optional name. Let's just call that pile of boxes number 3. And now if we want to add all the entities that are inside instance 2, if we want to add them, we can do a little for each loop inside our instance 2. And all we have to say is pile of boxes entity and add a child. And we can just add that entity that is being looped over that instance 2. That entity is being added as a child. Of course, finally, we also have to add this particular entity to the scene. So we can say entity.scene.entities and add that pile of boxes entity. So let's run this example as well. Load up the tutorial one more time. So now we can see our tutorial scene with the 3 prefabs loaded in. And let's just set a breakpoint on the update loop. So let's go back to Visual Studio, set a breakpoint which gets triggered immediately. And then inside Visual Studio, if we go to the Locals tab, we have the this entity, which is our prefabs demo script. And if we go to Entity, and then in this case, Raw View, and then all the way down here to Scene, notice it has 7 entities: the camera, the actual prefabs demo entity that this script is attached to. We have the original entity pile of boxes, which we placed directly inside the Stride game editor. Then when we created an instance of the pile of boxes prefab, which we referenced in through this property, those entities were added directly through that add range method. And then our last entity, we created that one from scratch and we called it pile of boxes 3, and we added the instantiated prefab content to that new entity. And that's the entity we see over here. And if we go to its children, notice how that one has the entities of the prefab. Well, that's it, folks. We've reached the end of the C# beginner tutorial series for the Stride game engine. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the Stride YouTube channel and give us a shout on the Stride Discord or forum if you have any questions. We hope you found this tutorial series very useful, that you've learned a couple of things that you may make really cool and awesome games with the Stride game engine.